Ilya Shapiro, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Great to be with you, John.
Yeah, so we've known each other for a while. It's been a while since we've spoken. I was excited to get you on the show because I'm trying, I think, like a lot of us, to grapple with what's happening in the news with President Trump, with the legal system. And I'm going to read a little bit of your bio for viewers so people understand why your name would pop into my head. So, you are the Director of Constitutional Studies at the Manhattan Institute. You've got a forthcoming book, Lawless, The Miseducation of America's Elites, which I'm excited to talk to you about as well. And, you have testified before Congress countless times. You've issued more than 500 or filed more than 500 amicus briefs with the Supreme Court, which maybe we'll talk about what that is and how those work. And then, you've got stellar credentials, although we tend to mock credentialism here at Dad Saves America, but Princeton University, London School of Economics, a JD of law from University of Chicago. So you know your stuff.
Before the places went completely crazy, yeah.
Yes, yes. Before they all became hotbeds of complete insanity, they were only partially insane.
Right.
Uh, so let's jump right into this case. Um, you called the Trump conviction a travesty of justice in a relatively short piece you wrote for the Manhattan Institute. So why is that the case? Make your case.
Yeah, so you could teach entire courses in Trump law in a law school. I mean, he is a frequent flyer in courtrooms and courthouses around the country, federal, state, civil, criminal. This is quite possibly the weakest case and the most politicized case of anything that Donald Trump is involved in. This is a state prosecution by the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, who campaigned in his last campaign on getting Trump. And even though the previous Manhattan DA declined to prosecute this same activity, and Alvin Bragg himself had previously declined to prosecute it, now he felt last year, when the indictment happened a little over a year ago, that this would be the opportune time to prosecute Donald Trump for, okay, let's get this straight, uh, paying money, hush money, to a porn star with whom he had an affair, and misrecording where that money came from, such that it was a violation of business records law, a technical fraud violation there. But those violations have a 2-year statute of limitations. And this goes back to 2016. So how do you get to that? Well, it turns into a felony and the statute of limitations is longer if that business fraud records violation is in furtherance of a further crime. What is that further crime? Well, it's defrauding the election campaign, maybe cheating on his taxes, maybe further business records violations. We don't know, according to the jury instructions that Judge Juan Merchan gave to the jury in this New York case. So it's unclear what that crime two is, and this is a politically motivated ticky-tack technical violation that if this is all that Donald Trump, the real estate developer, did, then he's the cleanest real estate developer in New York. But it's really a travesty that this, the only reason this is being prosecuted is not because he's a former president, not because it's Donald Trump, but because he's running for president again. And Alvin Bragg, as a lot of Democrats do, want to get rid of him and hurt him through this lawfare process. And at the same time, this sham prosecution taints the more serious ones that are ongoing but now paused with respect to mishandling classified records in federal court in Miami, with respect to trying to subvert the election process in Georgia, and similar January 6th related activities in federal court in DC. So those are all now paused or stayed, but at least those have some serious allegations to them. This is ticky-tack Banana Republic stuff. I don't necessarily blame the jury. They're doing their best, even if, they might be, not have voted for Trump, but the way that the judge acted during the trial, and especially Alvin Bragg, the prosecutor, really bring us all down and further lower the confidence in our institutions.
This is the thing why I wanted to talk about this. We're not like constantly talking about politics here at Dad Saves America, I don't think America gets saved by being partisan political hacks for either party. Um, but civics understanding in our country is not great. We test low on it. Our kids test low on it. And then the trust in the system seems to have collapsed. So the only thing that's less trusted than the Congress is the news media. And if the courts are also not trusted, like how does a society function if we don't believe that the justice system can be trusted?
We're at a historically low level of societal trust in America right now. Low level of confidence in our institutions. With respect to courts, left-wing activists have been attacking, trying to delegitimize the Supreme Court because they've lost control of it through various historical accidents and political machinations and whatnot in recent years. But still, the Supreme Court, it's rebounded a little bit from its low from a year or two ago, but it's still much more trusted than, as you said, Congress, the presidency, basically any other institution other than the military. Trust in which has also declined. And then, yeah, if you see the courts, if courts are seen as being completely a continuation of politics, that is bad indeed. That is Banana Republic stuff. That is how societies collapse. That's the story of, among other places, Argentina, which I know very well, which was, very well off through the 1920s, and then
Yeah.
took a wrong populist turn and kind of swung between left and right wing populism through the rest of the century, from which they're now trying to recover. But I mean, Americans' institutions are very much under threat in our polarized time. This is just not good, Bob. Not good.
I think you know, there's going to be there has already been a lot of
And by
sort
the
of
way, John, sorry to interrupt, but
please.
I have to say I'm not, a rabid MAGA Trumper or something like this. I'd rather we have other choices for our election. I'm not going to tell you how I'm going to vote or how I did vote in the last couple of elections, but I'm not, I'm a lover of the rule of law. I wrote my last book about Supreme Court politics and judicial nominations, and surprise, surprise, politics has always been a part of that process. And what's different now is, and this, a parallel to whether the Trump case or our political analysis, this general polarization, you have differing theories in the Supreme Court's case of constitutional interpretation, otherwise, in terms of what policy you might want, that's mapped neatly onto parties that are themselves more ideologically sorted and polarized than they've been since at least the Civil War, if not ever. And so we have this kind of no zero-sum game, battle to the death sort of situation, which again is not healthy.
Well, this does cut to the heart of, I think, the stuff that I think we should all be worried about, which is how. Well, let me ask you this: to what extent do you feel like this collapse in trust? And I do want to come back to the particulars of the Trump case, although that's not the primary objective for having this conversation, because plenty of people out there are covering it in every minute detail. But that collapse in trust in these institutions, in our courts, in the Department of Justice, in the Supreme Court. I had Martin Gurry on the show a few years back. He's written this book, The Revolt of the Public, and he lays the blame at this collapse in trust, first and foremost, technologically, at the internet and the information age, that we're now bombarded by just how crooked and broken everything is 24/7 in our feeds, whereas it used to be, the broken crookedness of our system and our institutions was hidden behind closed doors. And, you got the paper of record, like the New York Times or the Washington Post, and there were 3 articles that were fit to print. And, Walter Cronkite said, and that's the way it is. And that would be that. And so so one school of thought would be, and this might be true, and I'm curious what you think about this. No, everything's always been a broken mess. And now we just see it playing out in real time. Is that part of what's going on? Is that part of how you think about what's happening?
Yes and no. So it's absolutely true that we've had crises and institutional crises, Whether you talk about Watergate, whether you talk about other presidential scandals, whether you talk about the Clarence Thomas hearings or Robert Bork, the ushering in the modern age of toxic confirmation hearings. Um, what's different, I think, about the internet, and perhaps it's more the advent of the social media age more than the internet, because the internet has been with us for 25 years at this point. Um, and Jonathan Haidt has written about this in terms of the
Yeah.
addling of teenagers' minds and what that means for younger generations across a whole gamut of socioeconomic criteria or factors. You're on your social media feed or however you consume your information, and it only accentuates your predispositions. You're in an
Hmm.
echo chamber, epistemic closure, it's sometimes called, to use the fancy word for it. And we all kind of curate whether it's our entertainment that Netflix suggests based on what you've watched, you'll like this. Same thing
Yep.
happens with news consumption. Oh, you've enjoyed this. Try this slightly more crazy version of the same thing. Slightly more, red meat of your otherwise, left wing, right wing, populist, whatever proclivities. And so we kind of talk past each other. And not only do we have different opinions, but different facts and alternative facts and all of that. And there's been a geographic sorting such that fewer of us live around people who think differently than we do. And even if we do live in a more ideologically diverse community, shall we say, we still live in our imagined communities online, where we're still communicating with people who
Right.
all agree with us. So there's that kind of long tail effect and sorting and things like this. Combined with, we're still only a few years past the pandemic. Some people have never left the pandemic. That is a unique, once in a century, hopefully, experience that changed a lot of things and affected trust levels as well. So it's a confluence of lots of things. The racial reckoning after George Floyd, the explosion of DEI and CRT and all the stuff that goes into education and the rest of it. So I'm not a sociologist but there's a lot of complex stuff that has gone on. Um, you know, I don't know where you put the original inflection point, whether it's 9/11 or the rise of Facebook or smartphones or what it is. But the challenges now seem to be different even than, during such crises as the Great Depression or something. I'm not saying worse, I'm just saying different.
Yeah, it's true, and it's like you look back to the Great Depression. You have the packing of the threats to pack the court and all kinds of. It's always been a messy business,
And yet we
politics
had
and policy.
FDR winning landslides during the Depression, and then the war, which was a galvanizing, unifying event. Hard to imagine that. I mean, I think we had like 2 weeks of unification after 9/11, and then it went back to perhaps even a worse dynamic.
So, to come back to this moment and to the case with Trump in particular, we have, as I understand it, as you've explained, a misdemeanor at best of labeling something a legal expense when it's, essentially a settlement, which I'm not really sure what else you would call settlement money on the books, but a legal expense technically, but that's for tax lawyers to sort out. But a past the point of statute of limitations misdemeanor bookkeeping thing that's covering up gross behavior from a moral standpoint as a father and as a adult male that wants us to live it, be as virtuous as we can be. Like I don't want to talk to my kids about what Trump did wrong here. That's gross. Any more than talking about what Bill Clinton did wrong in the 90s or JFK did in the 60s. All gross. These are gross people. But why is, let's assume that this case is going to get overturned on appeal for the various reasons that it's such a contentious and seemingly small charge. Why is that important? Like, why is it important for there's obviously a whole school of thought saying, no, this is great. This is nobody's above the law in America. This is the rule of law.
Well,
This like
people who say that kind of liken this to getting Al Capone in jail finally on tax evasion. We can't get him on racketeering and murder and all that, but he did violate tax laws fair and square. We got him. This is not that. This is more Lavrenti Beria of the Soviet secret police saying, "Find me the man, and I'll find you the crime." A friend, mentor of mine, Harvey Silverglate, who's a civil libertarian in Massachusetts, wrote a book about a decade, maybe 20 years ago now, called Three Felonies a Day, saying that most of
yeah.
us who are professionals, we commit three felonies a day because there's over lawyering, over too much law, overlapping federal state jurisdictions, ambitious prosecutors who can indeed make up violations and crimes and prosecute whoever they like if they really want to, and especially in high-profile politicized cases like this. That is what's going on. No, I mean, if this were a conviction in one of those other prosecutions, then we could debate it seriously, because I think those are serious charges. Those are colorable and not politicized, regardless of what, again, I don't know why we have such crazy people involved in these stories, but the state prosecutor in Georgia has her own sex scandal and all of that stuff, paying off her paramour. Oh, who knows? But regardless, this is not, finally Donald Trump gets just desserts. This is, he deserves to be in jail. Sure. This, as might as well put him in jail for anything. Well, no, that's not how we should be thinking about these things.
There's a part of me that um, is happy about this in this sense. We do have a problem, it seems, of our leaders committing often heinous crimes. um, and I mean, in this case, in the context of their actual presidencies. I mean, you could argue President Bush lied to the public to get us into the war in Iraq. President Obama executed American citizens and had a kind of kill list that he directed as the commander in chief. And sure, one of the guys had renounced his citizenship, declaring because he was an Islamic fundamentalist, but we still killed him and his son, and he was an American citizen. His son was certainly an American citizen. And the list goes on and on and on. Even more recently,
I could push back on both of those as a lawyer, but I get your point. I mean, American citizens don't have more protections than non-Americans if they are legitimate targets, if they are actually terrorists, as we're learning in a different context of international law and rules of engagement in Gaza now in terms of what legitimate targets are. But I take your point, and that's why the Supreme Court is now taking up the case of presidential immunity, which is one of the arguments that Trump is making in his classified documents case out of Miami, where the court is not going to decide. This was never, in the realm of possibility that, as some of the staunchest Trump acolytes are saying, whatever the president does is above the law. As Richard Nixon said, if the president does it, it can't be illegal. No. What they're looking at is official acts. So, as you said, the Obama use of the drone to target al-Awlaki. We can debate whether that's a good policy decision. We can even debate the legalities, but should presidents, after they've finished their term in office, actually be prosecuted for those kinds of official acts? And can a court draw the line between something like that and something that a president does in his capacity as a private citizen, whether in the post-presidency or beforehand, some sort of crime? Or if he's drunk driving, I mean, I don't know why the president would be driving. He has his own limo, but let's say, Ulysses S. Grant back in the day was pulled over for speeding in his carriage. Right? He's doing that in his personal capacity? Can he be prosecuted for that? Once he leaves office, these are real issues, and the Supreme Court will come up with some sort of test to determine that. The feeling is that this is something different. What Trump is doing, or what he did, at least on January 6th or after the election, because I would argue that by far the worst and the only really debatable actions of Trump in terms of constitutional violations or is he a fit or not, happened after the election. Before that, it's mostly policy disputes. So is Donald Trump somehow different than these other examples that you're leading? You're saying a lot of our leaders commit crimes. I'm not sure about that. They do shady things. And when they actually commit crimes, they get prosecuted a fair amount. Look at Bob Menendez, the senator from New Jersey, with the gold bars and all that, or the congressman who had cash in his freezer and things like that. But
I mean, Congressman Thomas Massie tweeted about an article that I think was from 2017, basically pointing out that U.S. taxpayers have been forced to pay for millions and millions of dollars of settlements on behalf of sitting congressmen, which is in itself kind of an interesting context for this.
that you generally don't hear about. That's right. Yeah.
So it's like, okay, so we've got the taxpayer being forced to pay. How is that not like an induced campaign violation? What's going on there? Everything about that's bizarre. But I guess the bigger picture for me is, and I don't know how I think about this, and I'm really curious to talk about it with you. When is there a philosophy or a way of thinking about when a battle should be played out in democracy versus in the courtroom? And is that line blurry? Maybe I think all of these lines end up probably being blurry, but can you help sharpen that for me? Because I I think we're all feeling like we don't know who's a criminal or not. Like, is Anthony Fauci a criminal for what appears to be being caught lying to the public a lot? Is former CIA directors that have gotten in front and current act, like, was it Clapper who got before Congress and while in the alphabet soup, I think it was maybe CIA, saying, no, we are not actively spying on American citizens. And that was a lie. So isn't that a crime to get in front of the public and lie? Nothing happens. These people come out of office. They become pundits on television. They get Netflix deals and end up with mansions in Martha's Vineyard. And all of that feels like it's part of the same corruption of our so-called institutions to me. I hit you with a lot there. I'm sorry, but
I mean, those are bad things. I don't know what there is to say about that. Dave Petraeus was prosecuted for sharing classified information with his mistress. Um, yeah, I mean, I think more officials should be probably prosecuted. Certainly, more executive officials federally should be impeached. Not just the president, but we should have legitimate, not politicized, but dereliction of duty and doing all sorts of things that are showing contempt for their office and for the separation of powers and things like that. I think probably we should have impeachments for more than sexual picadillos and cover-ups and things like that.
is there a sort of legal
I
philosophy
mean, there
though
there are there are
for
there are
this?
gray zones. There are gray zones. It's the Supreme Court has a doctrine. Our judicial system has a doctrine called the political question doctrine, where courts are not going to decide political disputes between the branches. On the other hand, what's a political dispute and what's applying the Constitution and the scope of the federal power to regulate interstate commerce? The thinking with the Obamacare challenges that John Roberts said this ultimately decided, chickened out from invalidating Obamacare because he said, oh, it's an election year. The American voters will decide whether they want it or not in 2012. And that's, first of all, I don't want my judges playing, JV politician or pundit or what have you. But secondly, if there is a constitutional violation, their job is to say, what the law is and call it as they see it, and then let the political branches respond. If it's an unpopular decision, the political branches can respond accordingly. And for too long, the courts have not been doing that, and so have been allowing, for example, Congress to punt its power away to the administrative branch. So that then when the executive takes certain decisions, congressmen and senators say, hey, that wasn't me. I voted for all these good things. And then this deputy undersecretary bureaucrat started screwing you over. Go sue them. And so there's been a warping in that kind of system. So there's no clear definition of what is a political question, or what should be left to the voters versus what should be left to the courts, other than policy decisions or clashes of values should be left to the voters or their elected representatives. Whereas if it's a legal determination, leave that to the judges. And there's always going to be a judgment call. That's why, we have human judges. We don't just, no matter how sophisticated the AI will get, I don't think we'll ever replace human judges with, machines. But just because the line is hard to draw doesn't mean that you take up cases and do your best and call the shots as you see them.
Help me. One of the things that you wrote about in the brief article about the case, calling it a travesty of justice, you pointed to the different things that are probably surface area for appeal. One of them being that Judge Merchan, his direction to the jury was peculiar, and people have talked about this. That I want to make sure I represent this properly. That functionally, he said, the reason these 34 counts, which more or less are all basically triple, quadruple counting the same underlying action.
Well, each time he wrote a check to Michael Cohen to pay off Stormy Daniels was a separate count.
Right. So it's all the same thing. There's not 34 different unique things, really. They're all just like every bookkeeping entry was considered a count. But that the reason this rises to the level of a felony is because it is in the service of this other crime, that this misdemeanor accounting thing is in the service of another crime, which I thought was supposed to be a felony, although it seems like some of them might not be felonies, and some of them might not even have jurisdiction in New York because it's campaign violations.
Campaign finance law. And get this further thing that I didn't put in my article in City Journal was that Trump's team had a former chairman of the Federal Election Commission, Brad Smith, who's a friend of mine, professional colleague, ready to testify as an expert about federal election law, to basically say that, even if everything was true on the facts, that did not constitute a federal election campaign violation. And the judge wouldn't let them bring that evidence in. So that's appealable error as well.
And what was the justification for not allowing a former FEC official to weigh in on whether this underlying crime is in fact even a crime?
It's unclear, to be honest. I mean, again, I wasn't the closest follower of this trial because I have better things to do than follow these weird minutiae. But the ruling had to have been that it wasn't relevant, that it wasn't central. So if the legality under federal campaign finance law isn't central, or the definition of that law, then what is it? Jurors have to conjure up their own other election violation, or, as you said, as you were alluding to, the judge's instruction was, if some of them thought it was an election in furtherance of a campaign finance violation, some of them thought it was in furtherance of tax evasion, others thought it was in furtherance of further business records violations. That was all okay. They didn't all have to agree on what that second crime that the original business records violations were in furtherance of are. Just bizarre. If that's a correct statement of New York law, then I think Trump has a further Sixth Amendment claim, or due process claim, about the propriety of the New York law in the first place, that would allow that kind of jury charge and allow a conviction for this kind of nebulous, undefined second crime.
In prepping to come in and talk to you today, we looked up this. The World Justice Project has a proposed working definition of rule of law, and I want to read the 4 principles and talk about them. So these 4 principles are: number 1, a system of self-government in which all persons, including the government, are accountable under the law, so no one's above the law. Number 2, a system based on fair, publicized, and broadly understood and stable laws. So this one seems really important, like that people know about and understand the laws that they are being subjected to in order for their actions to be deemed criminal or not. Number 3, a fair, robust, and accessible legal process in which rights and responsibilities based in law are evenly enforced. So no, to the best of our ability, no discrimination like, oh, I don't like you, so I'm going after you and I'm going to let you get off the hook because I like you. And number four, diverse, competent, and independent lawyers and judges. So those are the four components. What do you think of that definition of rule of law? Let's start there.
The first three are pretty standard. I've never heard of the World Justice Project, so I don't know if they have any sort of agenda, but the first three are pretty standard. The last one, diverse, competent lawyers and judges. I don't know what diverse means, whether it be our current battles over DEI or whether it be different ideologies or something. But competent, I agree, is a necessary part of it. But yeah,
So
generally speaking, that's a pretty standard definition. And you paused on the stable, understandable, transparent law. That is very important because you neither want, what is the opposite of the rule of law? It's the rule of man. It's the king saying, I'm going to jail you. Why? Who cares? I just, whatever. I just make up a law. You violated it. You're going to jail. Or secret law, right? You could have, it being applied equally to everyone, but nobody knows when they're violating the law, which in effect also gives the powers that be the power to arrest and imprison anyone whenever they like. So that all of those things are very important. I think there's, a failure of that here.
you referenced this book, which I'd come across a while back. This three felonies a day, or that our system of laws is so monumentally complex that it seems like the complexity itself violates the second principle. I mean, is that fair? Is it escapable? Is there a solution to it? I mean, the Federal Registry is something like 75,000 pages. So I can't even read statutes. I don't know who can read these things. There's this self-referential 1,500-page
There are
documents.
a lot of kind of ticky-tack rules and administrative regulatory crimes, things that can get you sent to jail that no Congress or state legislature passed. That's kind of scary. I do think we have an over criminalization and also an over federalization of criminal law. So it used to be, that we talk from time to time or you hear about double jeopardy, the idea of, there's a constitutional protection against being prosecuted twice for the same crime. Well, the Supreme Court recently decided in the last few years that it turns out the federal government and the state government can prosecute you for the same crime. That didn't used to be possible until maybe half a century ago, at this point, 70 years ago, maybe the decades keep slipping, where the federal criminal code has expanded such that it overlaps with state criminal codes, which, would have been beyond the conception of the framers. So yeah, we definitely do have a problem of too much law, and whether you're talking in the white collar realm, whether you're talking in the political realm, in the blue collar realm, sometimes it's less of a problem, but even there, it's not, murder is murder and rape is rape and things like that. But there are all sorts of weird, whether it's drug crimes or brandishing a gun crimes, use of force in the Armed Career Criminal Act, all of these sorts of things that, it takes a 5-4 Supreme Court to delineate what exactly the law is.
Take me to take me to school for a sec here. So, the basic the basic structure of these institutions, I want to make sure help me understand. So Alvin Bragg is the district attorney, right? And that's an elected office. So explain what that role is supposed to be and why it's elected instead of appointed.
In the American system, different countries do it differently, but in the American system, certainly at the state level, DAs are generally elected. I don't know if there's some who are appointed. There might be special DAs or what have you. But so Alvin Bragg is the head prosecutor for Manhattan, the island of Manhattan, which is its own county. And that means that he's responsible for enforcing state law. He is one of many state prosecutors across New York State. which again, I'm not, even though I'm a member of the Bar of New York, it's been a while since I studied New York specific law, New York constitutional law, how their relationship is to the Attorney General of New York, who's separately elected and is the head law enforcement officer of the state writ large over all, civil and criminal issues. Um, and so Bragg runs on a party line. These are partisan elections, and the campaigns and says, in this case, he said I was going to get Trump, among other things that he campaigned on, which you know looks odd. But again, we've had elected prosecutors for a long time, and they make all sorts of promises. What's weirder, though, or a second derivative of that, is that in a lot of places, judges run for elections, sometimes also on partisan lines. You have contenders who are Republicans, Democrats, whatever else. Now, there are more regulations about judicial elections typically, and judges generally can't, or they can be brought up on ethics charges if they say, if you elect me, I will put so and so in jail or something like that. But still, I think there's something unseemly about that. So, prosecutorial elections, because at the end of the day, this is the people's justice. And if we have checks and balances operating correctly, rogue prosecutors will be roped in by other aspects of the system. Judges, I'm not in favor of electing. I like the federal system where you have the executive branch nominate and the legislative branch confirm them, but different states do it in different ways.
Is there a is there a philosophy about when a role like this should be, you're alluding to it, should be appointed by elected officials versus being an elected official themselves? Is there like a framework for thinking about when that makes sense?
It's the idea is this the people's representative, or is their job something other than representing popular opinion or will or values or what have you? And so the prosecutors are supposed to enforce the law on behalf of the people. When you bring criminal charges, as in the Trump case, it's the people versus Donald Trump. It's not Alvin Bragg. It's not, city of Manhattan or something like that. You can have city prosecutions, but this one is the people versus Donald Trump. Um, Judges are different. Judges are often doing things that might be unpopular because they're enforcing constitutional rights and protections, or saying that this government program that everyone likes, actually the government can't do that. So they play a different role in our system of checks and balances. Presidents are elected. We can debate whether we like the electoral college or not or whatever, but there's an accountability to the people. Bureaucrats are appointed by the president to execute the law, to enforce the law. So we don't necessarily want them elected separately because they're all, in theory, supposed to be accountable to the president. And there are court cases when arguably bureaucracies or particular agencies go beyond their power and they're creating law in their own right when nobody elected them. So those are continuing fights that we have. But again, in our system of separated powers, we have different people playing different roles. So the judicial power is fundamentally different than the executive power, which is the prosecutor, or the legislative power, which is creating the legislating the crimes that the prosecutor is then enforcing.
I did a video earlier this year, and it's a very elemental video, really. It's like sort of civics 101, talking about the sense in which America, the United States, is not a democracy. We are a republic. And that properly understood should be seen as we are a nation first and foremost of laws, not merely of popular will. That the Bill of Rights is entirely basically a structure of things that says the government, and therefore popular democracy, shall not do X, Y, Z, etc. Like the First Amendment's fundamental protection, as I understand it, is just because speech is unpopular, it will remain legal and it must be so. And that's why democracy is not allowed to act against our freedom of speech. When we don't have that protection, you have what's happening in the UK, where if you say the wrong thing now, you can get arrested in Scotland, and so that there's this tension between this concept of the rule of law and democracy. Help me understand that, and help our viewers sort of understand what that means.
Well, it depends what your end goal is, what your highest value is. If it's majority rule, then you want pure democracy. That's majority rule, which can put Socrates to death, is the classical example. I don't know what the closest thing we have to pure democracy. At a national level, probably Switzerland. They have lots of local votes on particular policy issues and national votes and national referenda and so forth. In this country, we have in New Hampshire and in New England in general, they have a lot of town meetings where all the citizenry comes and participates. The New Hampshire state legislature has the lowest number of constituents per representative. They have something like 800 people in their state legislature, even though representatives, even though it's a very small state. But I don't think most people's end goal is majority rule. It's something like liberty, equality. Under our Constitution, under our Declaration of Independence, it's about securing and protecting our freedoms. We institute government to secure and protect our inalienable rights, right? And so the dilemma, as Madison explained, right over my right shoulder here, I have the authors of the Federalist Papers, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. Madison wrote my favorite Federalist paper, number 51. I don't know what yours is, but talking about how the dilemma in forming a government is in empowering it to do what it needs to do to secure and protect our rights and facilitate our flourishing, our pursuit of happiness, to borrow from the Declaration of Independence, our rights to life and liberty in the pursuit of happiness, while at the same time obliging it to check itself, to guard itself, because men aren't angels. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels govern men, government would be perfect. But we don't live in that utopia. And so in a world where men govern men, we have to write all these rules and force the government itself, as you said in that first criterion by the World Justice Project of the rule of law, you force the government to check itself. So people misunderstand this, and they say, well, that's not upholding democracy. Well, I don't care. I want to uphold life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which should be the ultimate goal. That's why I'm not an anarchist, because I think you do need government to protect you against marauding gangs and what have you. But obviously government can get out of control and can endanger those rights itself. So that's the challenge of political theory 101.
Yeah, it's something that has seems to have been um, almost banished from discourse and lost in our education system. That is the fundamental tension we face when we come upon these crises that sit sort of at the intersection of our politics and our legal system. Do you believe that this Trump case in particular, but the broader scope of what's happening in the justice system is fundamentally biased in a particular direction? Like I think a lot of Americans feel like the system is rigged. That statement has purchase with the public for a reason. How do you think about that?
Well, I just don't buy into broad scale conspiracy theories because it's very hard to get that many people to agree on one particular goal and row in the same direction. And we even talk about the justice system. There are many justice systems. Alvin Bragg does not report to Merrick Garland, for example, even though for some reason he borrowed a DOJ prosecutor to join his team. Um, you can distrust various kinds of institutions. They could all be wrong and weak and merit improvement, but not because there's some nefarious force behind the scenes that's pulling all of these strings. So I think we have, this prosecution is particularly weak because we have an elected prosecutor in a blue city, in a blue state, with a judge who, donated to anti-Trump organizations, who like all of these sorts of things that are just fail the constitutional, and by constitutional, I don't mean, the document in the National Archives. I mean in the sense of people's beliefs in the institutions, the structures that we are all part of in this country, the polity. It fails that smell test. Um, but it's kind of idiosyncratic. I don't think the Alvin Bragg's prosecution of Trump is the same kind of, or exposes the same kind of structural problem as, I don't know, warrantless wiretapping of Americans or something like this, or Anthony Fauci. I mean, they're all complicated issues. They all show failures of guardrails and how we can have temporary authoritarian moments and things like this. And they're worth discussing, but I don't think it's all part of one kind of conspiratorial tale about the deep state or the elites or something like that.
There is uh several years ago I read a book that I imagine you know pretty well, Charles Murray's Coming Apart. And for those that aren't familiar with this book, it's pretty powerful, and it feels like it is like a predecessor to the moment we're in. And that what he basically lays out in that book, and it's a look at basically data, like sociological data. And it says, hey, we have become culturally two Americas, and he's only looking to avoid the politics of race. He only looks at the data for white Americans, and what he notes is there is this super cluster of beliefs and behaviors and cultural norms and ways of living that constitute, really, frankly, the elite. And he says that the elite, we work in knowledge and information fields, live in sort of clustered zip codes. He calls them super zips. Sort of, we all watch HBO. I mean, absolutely be in that category. So would you.
Worked hard to get into that category. Came as an
Yeah, it's
immigrant
like,
refugee from the Soviet Union, and all that. Yeah.
right. So he's
By the
got
way, I'm not
that.
wearing a Princeton polo on purpose. I just happened to have gone to my 25th reunion 2 weekends ago and gotten a new shirt, but it's very comfortable. But lots of problems. I
I
mean,
will.
my next book is called Lawless: The Miseducation of America's Elites. So yes, there are tremendous pathologies in our elites, groupthink, going along to get along, kind of the next development of what David Brooks, when he came to Princeton 20 years ago after I graduated, and wrote about the organizational kids who are kind of just in it not to make waves so much as to become the elite, and they all kind of think the same way and intermarry and do all the rest of it, which is different than what the elite was in the 60s or earlier days.
Well, this is a good segue into your forthcoming book, because I think I think Trump as a figure, um, even though he's a wealthy businessman a Manhattanite, like along many dimensions, maybe every dimension, you'd say he is absolutely an elite. He was friends with the Clintons. He knew Jeffrey Epstein. There's all kinds of reasons to say, well, of course, Trump is obviously an elite. But there's also this fact that he's very much an avatar for the everyman, or he is seen as that. And I think to some extent credibly, the way he talks, even just being a New Yorker has a certain amount of that, like, no BS way. Um, how do you think about the elite? What does it mean that they're being miseducated? What's going on there?
Well, first of all, I want to cabin the discussion of Trump because I don't know how to think of him in this context. He's an outer borough guy from the Queens, but he was born into a wealthy family and educated in the Ivy League, if you count Penn as Ivy, and has been a real estate developer, celebrity. He's been a celebrity for most of my lifetime. He was in, what was it, Home Alone or the Home Alone
Yeah.
2? I mean, all of these movies in the 80s.
But in reality TV too. So it's like
Absolutely.
reality
And then
TV is the.
yes, absolutely. So he's been this celebrity, wealthy real estate developer. So is he hated because he's a class traitor, because he's an imposter? I mean, who knows? All of the above, none of the above. Anyway, cabin that. My focus of my book is legal education and law schools and the legal profession, because other than, I guess, medicine, which is literally a life and death practice, and that's showing to be a lot of problems. The revelations last month about UCLA Medical School that's hiring and doing all sorts of DEI stuff, so students can't even pass their boards and don't know the basics. Anyway, that's a nightmare. But
Yeah.
setting aside medicine, law lawyers are the gatekeepers of our political and legal institutions. All this rule of law stuff that we've been talking about. This is today's law students become tomorrow's judges, general counsels, prosecutors, partners at firms, like all of it, right?
Yes.
And so if they're, forget what's going, if we've lost already the English and sociology departments, they go crazy, with apologies to my friends in the humanities, that's too bad for the, loss to the richness of human life and the accumulation of human knowledge and all of this. But it's not as big a deal as if, tomorrow's federal judges are against the idea of due process and free speech because those are hallmarks of white supremacy or something like that. And that is the cultural perversion that's going on in legal education right now, and a lot of higher ed, particularly so-called elite higher ed, where admissions offices screen for activism rather than acumen, where then the student affairs and DEI offices inculcate these cultures of viewing everything through identitarian lenses and privilege hierarchies, where professors then teach that certain things are illegitimate and the Supreme Court's illegitimate in this case should be ignored, and don't even teach originalism, which is malpractice because regardless of whether you think it's a good theory of interpretation, roughly half the federal judiciary believes in it. So to be a good advocate, you have to understand it. But no, anyway, law schools have kind of gone off the rails, especially the elite ones. And this is a story of bureaucracy and growing, exploding bureaucracy as much as it is of shifting ideology or kind of the sociology of youth.
My understanding is that a lot of what philosophically, rhetorically underpins this identity politics time we're in was born in law schools. That critical theory, critical race theory, um, is a product of the legal scholars, that intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, that this came out of, again, out of the
Yep, she's
law
in my book.
space.
Absolutely. Derek Bell, all those folks. I mean, it's an older story. Critical theory is like returned with a vengeance in the last 10 years. When I was in law school, I graduated law school in 2003. We thought all of that crit stuff, the critical legal stuff at least, was a thing of the past. It had spent for some niche that kind of barely made a dent in legal teaching and now is relegated to some, optional clinical things that, if you were kind of a crazy left winger, you might delve into, but otherwise had no relevance. And then it came back. But even before you had the Derek Bells and the Kimberly Crenshaws and the critical legal studies, you just had the critical theory itself, which originated, kind of came over from Europe, from Germany and Austria, settled in Columbia University, which has been in the news for other stuff lately. The Frankfurt School, it's called, and kind of delegitimizing systems, and there's nothing, there's no objectivity, and where you stand depends on where you sit, and there's no objective truth, and all of these sorts of things that are very philosophical that then entered academia in different ways, eventually entering the law. And that's a huge problem because this is completely orthogonal, completely against the founding principles of America, of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, equality, securing liberty, everyone being treated equally, etc. Yes, we have our sins and our warts and slavery and Jim Crow and all that, and that's also against our founding principles. But it's also, by the way, against the core mission of any institution of higher education, which is supposed to be about open inquiry and creating human knowledge, the classical liberal values of academic freedom and due process, treating everyone equally. This what's sometimes called postmodern theory, although it's decades old at this point, is against all that and wants to blow it up because of fundamental injustices that call for burning down the system and replacing it with something else.
So I can't recall exactly the wording, but I have seen laid out very explicit calls in some of these writers. It might have been Derek Bell to reject liberalism, and liberalism here meaning, more broadly, the constitutional republicanism that we're talking about, the notion that equality of under the law, that the law applies to all of us equally, regardless of our identity, and therefore shouldn't really take our identity into account. It should take our actions and intentions into account, but not our identity, and not discriminate. That discrimination is actually bad in the law, and this school of thought, as I understand it, explicitly says no. We reject that. We are for, as Ibram X. Kendi said, discrimination to counter past discrimination. Is that a correct understanding on my part about what this critical theory framework asserts?
That's right. And to expand upon that a little bit, your rights, your freedoms aren't the same. Not every citizen or every person isn't supposed to have the same rights and freedoms, but vary depending on where you are in an intersectional, that's kind of the blending of identities matrix, or a hierarchy of privilege, or whether you're in an oppressor or oppressed class. The foreign policy view of that is, the attack on Israel and other things like that, the post-colonialism, the decolonial movement. But the domestic side of that is, as you said, being against our founding vision, against being liberal. And ironically, there's some commonality there with those on the right who want a post-liberal world as well, because the liberal world of neutral rules will never get us to these fundamental basic goals that we all prefer, this virtuous republic that you want. And so there's a lot of problems with that too. But of course, the right-wing non-liberals are not the ones who are in control of higher ed. It's exclusively the left that's there, and sometimes the left side of the spectrum doesn't know what the far left is doing. That's at least the general story bureaucratically within law schools, within higher ed more broadly, where most deans, most presidents are not social justice warriors. They're not woke radicals, but they will placate those illiberal tendencies because of how they read the cost-benefit analysis, and because they're often spineless cowards. So that is the nefarious dynamic that's been in place, and why higher ed has been revealed. It's been in crisis for a while, but really post October 7th, and with the disastrous testimony of a series of university presidents, has been revealed in the national discourse to be, fundamentally flawed.
So what has happened that has given rise to this transformation at this time? I saw on Twitter, it might have been Phil Magnus posted an image of conservative and liberal versus liberal self-identified university faculty. And there was points where it was almost parity in the 60s and 70s, and then 80, 85 starts to change, and then 90s, 2000s to today, number of self-identified conservatives shrinks slightly. Number of self-identified liberal or progressives goes up dramatically. So both the size, the amount of faculty increases, but the ratio goes totally nuts. So it becomes, I know, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have laid this kind of stuff out. You go into some of these departments and you won't find a single person who would call themselves right of center. What happened there? From your perspective?
It's partly a story of the creation and expansion of less rigorous departments, the blank studies departments, not your traditional, history, economics, English, engineering, etc., but all these studies departments that had different academic standards and were more about how big of an activist you are, or do you represent this or that demographic box? And then there's relatedly the development of scholarship that's more in service to activism rather than development of knowledge. And so, what used to be confined to those studies fields has now entered those mainstream traditional departments. And so, whether it's explicitly with DEI statements to be hired, or just what kind of scholarship is rewarded and published by the academic journals and other gatekeepers of, and credentialers, that get people hired and promoted and tenured, and get grants and things like that, have been more in an activist mode. And so even if you kept constant for those ideological ratios, the, let's say, millennial professor, all other things being equal, is more activist than his or her boomer counterpart. And you have a lot of the retiring, older, more senior professors now who are scared of their younger colleagues, scared of their students, don't want to be part of cancel culture or whatever else, even though they've, never voted for a Republican in their lifetime. That's silly. They think, Trump is just as bad as their colleagues do. But this dynamic, their approach to the professorial academic scholarship craft is very different. But then, as much or more of the story, and in my book, I try to focus on this because it's less sexy and doesn't get as much coverage, is the bureaucratic part. Regardless of what's going on with ideological bias in the faculty, and what Phil Magnus has pointed out is absolutely true, that skew even more to the left, as well as the dynamic of becoming more activist rather than scholarly. Um, there are now more uh, bureaucrats, non-teaching staff, than faculty in almost any university. That is accentuated in the more elite ones. And in many places, there are now more non-teaching staff than students, which is remarkable. Yale is one of these places. Like, the joke is, 100 years ago, every incoming Yalie would have their own personal butler with them. Well, now all these educrats, as I call them, are they going to be butlers for the Yaleys? And in part, they are, because the student affairs staff and the DEI staff is there to hold their hands and coddle them and deal with their quote unquote traumas. And that's, an aspect of safetyism that has perverted kind of the campus cultures as well. But that bureaucratic bloat is not only expensive and a waste of money and sucks away funds that could be going to underprivileged scholarships for underprivileged kids or whatever else, hiring better faculty, who knows? But in and of itself, that bureaucracy warps academic culture because they're not steeped in traditional academic values. They have their own bureaucratic goals to expand their fiefdoms in various ways. So that has been especially in the last 5, 10 years, has been such a huge part of the story.
Why would bureaucratic bloat, which seems to be an inherent problem of every it seems like an inherent problem in every human institution if it lives long enough. I worked in Viacom, which is now called Paramount, and maybe will soon be called Skydance. But the HR department at Viacom had no idea what we did. They were utterly useless for trying to hire anybody that would be good at their job inside of Spike or Nickelodeon. They were bureaucracy. They were there basically as a kind of ever-present liability management apparatus. And then, the thing that would happen inside of Viacom and other companies is you'd have a recession. And suddenly you'd take a closer look at, like, wait, what are you doing? Are you doing anything useful? All right, you're fired. Um, is there a lack of feedback loop in academia that allows this cancer to just grow unchecked forever? Is it because Harvard's basically like a hedge fund with a tiny school attached to it with $60 billion earning compound interest? Like, why is this happening this way?
Yes, and this is like an improv class. Yes, all of that is true. But also, the trustees aren't doing their jobs. They kind of just roll over for whatever the president and his or her coterie of vice presidents and vice deans and assistant provosts, et cetera, want to foment, because it's prestigious to be a trustee. You get to be nostalgic about your college days. You get, regardless of whether you're nominally an R or a D, you get good football tickets and basketball tickets and all the rest of that. And so there's not that check on the university administrations. I should disclose that I'm a Ron DeSantis appointee to the board of Florida Polytechnic University, which is a fairly young school, only 10 years old. So we don't have these kind of crazy problems. We're dealing with a problem of growth and brand management and things like this. But anyway, Too few governors for public schools, by the way, have been doing what DeSantis, Youngkin here in Virginia, Abbott a little bit in Texas, some others have finally learned that these appointments to especially their flagship schools are just as, if not more important than, whoever your, deputy secretary of transportation is or whatever. But anyway, so trustees is a part of it. Um, uh, uh, as you hire more bureaucracy because to be politically correct, to respond to whether it's the racial reckoning or COVID or what have you, they all have to busy themselves by justifying their own roles and growing their budgets. And so whether it's student orientations or continuing programming or enforcing speech codes or finding violations of, Me Too related violations to investigate where the process is the punishment, all of that dynamic has been happening, where the university leaders, the real ones, the ones that existed before this era of bureaucratic bloat, are too scared or have no reason to check their power. So even the deans of elite law schools will defer to their DEI dean or the university's DEI dean or what have you. Because if they do, that is the path of least resistance until very recently. Now we're in the eye of the storm where alumni are starting to pay attention, and this makes national news. And there's a scandal at Yale every other week, and all the rest of it. But that's grown unchecked, and it's not the issue that bureaucracy grows. Yes, bureaucracy always grows because everything always grows in the long term. But it needs to be maintained as a proper percentage of the total. So if your student body isn't growing and your faculty isn't growing, why would your bureaucracy need to be growing?
I've seen some critics of what's happened in universities lay the blame at what you would call maybe consumerification of higher education. That what these things are basically lazy rivers and credential factories where you get to meet a bunch of people that you'll ultimately work together with at Goldman Sachs. And while you're at it, you binge drink and float down a lazy river that cost a fortune to make. And the reason why they made the lazy river was to convince you to come to their school. And so it's a kind of like, well, please the consumer being the student model. It's a kind of anti-capitalist critique of what's happened to higher ed. How much of that's true?
Lazy rivers are always invoked in that. I'm actually curious now. I've never looked it up, but I wonder how many universities in this country actually do have lazy rivers. That and climbing walls tend to be invoked in this discussion.
If we include metaphoric lazy rivers, I think there's a lot.
Right, right. Uh, well, schools are competing with each other for students. And so I guess they decided they can't compete on the quality of their history departments for whatever reason. And so they have to compete on the size of their gyms and things like this. Which is bizarre. So that's part of the bureaucratic bloat. Student affairs grew even before we had DEI departments and things like that to create more study breaks and Nerf gun fights and intramural ultimate frisbee games and all the rest of the things that student affairs offices have done and have where the bureaucratic bloat started. But the consumerization is also a complicated sort of thing. It's kind of in society, it became, this idea arose that you weren't successful or you couldn't become part of the elite, or you certainly couldn't join the managerial class unless you had that college degree. The federal government in enhancing the availability and ease of getting student loans. There's that part, which obviously is now a political hot potato of a different kind.
Yeah.
But an 18-year-old can go to that school that offers them the lazy river and 4 years of binge drinking while they major in, feminist studies or what have you, and then gets a job in the HR department of Viacom and creates perversions there, I suppose. I don't know. That's part of what's been going on. But yeah, higher ed has certainly lost its moorings as providing actual skills that will then be used in the post-collegiate world. There's starting to be a bit of a market feedback to that, in that in a lot of industries, a lot of companies now would rather hire someone from Purdue, say, where Mitch Daniels did a bang up job when he was president, rather than an entitled kid from Harvard, Yale, Princeton. Because it turns out that you can't really monetize the latest intersectional theory so well to sell more widgets to whatever your market is.
Yeah, I as an employer myself, it is a demerit to be overcome if you've got an Ivy League degree. For me, it's like,
And it's
okay,
and
Harvard,
because
huh?
and because of grade inflation and pass fail, you can't differentiate.
Yeah, I heard that the average grade at Harvard is an A. There's no world in which anything based on merit or achievement or mastery produces such a thing. Take this back to why does this matter? You're a legal scholar, a constitutional scholar. Why does higher ed matter to me as an American that wants my kids' future to be bright?
We need people who learn things to be able to fulfill certain jobs. There's that trade school aspect to it. As well as get them ready for professional schools, whether that be medical school and law school. Clearly you need higher ed for that. We can debate whether you need a 4-year degree to be able to enter medical school or law school or what have you. In other countries, they don't necessarily do it that way. That's a valid debate to be had. There's experimentation. Some law schools have agreements that you only do 2 or 3 years. Anyway, there's a creation of knowledge. There's the kind of, the classical humanities education or scholarship for its own sake. I think that's probably a rather small piece of the pie of why we need the whole higher ed institutions. And it's passing on the culture of society at large, preparing people to be leaders in various fields. And again, we can debate whether it's working that way or it's working too well, and the problem is with the exact cultures and mores that are being transmitted. But I think, you know, uh, higher ed is done right, can be a growth engine and a happiness engine for society. Done wrong, it spews out pathologies that, and we've seen too much of that in recent years.
To come back to uh, play out for me that what happens now with our legal system as we get into generations who are the product of the type of like legal degree that you've described, where we now have this super identitarian activist thing taking place where you're not even studying originalism.
When you're not studying the Constitution, or if you are, it's to undermine it because it's an outmoded, document written by rich white men slave owners.
Right. Well, let's pause here for a sec. Um, why is the Constitution 250 years later, just about, uh, it is it still operable? Is it still relevant? I saw the current president, President Biden, is continuing to forgive student loans, even though our Supreme Court has said no, you cannot do that. So, is this a dead letter? Why should I care about the Constitution?
Well, there's the question of is it relevant and is it being observed? And the answer to the second is not always and not enough. The answer to the first is absolutely it's relevant because it is the governing manual for our government, not for our society, for our government, how the checks and balance work, the division of powers between the federal government and the states, the relationship of the individual citizen to both the federal government and the states. And here's where I should add that you said 250 years. Well, we've amended it many times, most importantly after the Civil War that we fought, that fundamentally restructured the relationship between these levels of government and the citizens, which is why people call the post-Civil War period the second founding. Getting rid of slavery, of course, but the 14th Amendment, before the 14th Amendment, you couldn't sue your state in federal court if it was oppressing you in various ways. Very important. And the problem is, starting in the New Deal era, we sort of lost the ability to think about constitutional amendment. At that time of crisis, the New Dealers basically said, if something needs to be done, then let's just do it. The Constitution be damned. And so we amended and expanded federal power sub rosa without amending the Constitution, even though there would have been popular support for, I don't know, unemployment insurance or widows and orphans benefits. And if there hadn't have been support for that in the depths of the Great Depression, well, then maybe we should have rethought those programs. But we're worse off with this idea of thinking that constitutional amendments are only something for getting rid of slavery or giving women the right to vote. It's supposed to be much more than that, and we had many more amendments between the founding and the in the early days than we have, unfortunately, in the last 100 years or so. But the Constitution is supposed to protect our rights. It's supposed to protect our freedoms, both against state governments, federal governments, and against the state and federal governments that set up their systems of justice in ways that violate our rights. So if we get rid of the Constitution, or we ignore it, or we only observe it selectively, which is the same as getting rid of it, well, then we go back to the rule of man. Then it's the arbitrary rule of might makes right. And I'm frequently reminded of the scene for A Man for All Seasons, about this involves in medieval England, where someone connives to get to betray Sir Thomas More to become Attorney General of Wales, and the More says, well, profit not a man to sell his soul for the whole world, but for Wales. That's the most famous part. But there's another part where you try to convict someone regardless of any other concerns. And again, the issue is, well, if you get, would you cut down all the laws in England to get to the devil? And again, I think Richard Rich is his name. Richie Rich says, yes, of course I would. It's the devil. It's like, oh, well, what would happen then if you've cut down all the laws and the devil turns around on you, and then there's no more protections for you? So it's very important. And we have all these counter-majoritarian protections for individual rights thereby, which are observed increasingly in the breach. And this is, to go back to education, is the problem of civics and otherwise. And even before we get to higher ed, in K to 12, that we're taught all the things that are wrong and bad and don't work about our country, but not how, what the Constitution says, why it was done that way, and how it should work in an ideal world.
How, you've got the founders over your shoulder. You have a obvious reverence for the Constitution and for the framework that it laid out. What, for the viewer who is like, I love this, I'm going to share this conversation with my kids because they're probably not getting this in school. What do Americans need to understand about the reasons why the founders set up our system of government with all of its restrictions on itself the way that they did? What were they afraid of? I mean, you've touched on it already, like the rule, like arbitrary rule of the majority. But if you can expand on that, and place me in that time, what are the founders saying that makes it so important to bind the government in and around itself in a fairly complex structure of checks and balances?
It's now almost commonplace to say, but at the time, this was revolutionary. These political theories that the founders brought to bear about self-governance, that free people have a right to self-governance. And, if their rulers are not accountable to them and don't reflect their views, as King George was oppressing them in various ways, then they have the right and even the duty to throw off those shackles and create their own government. But as we discussed, they have to create that government not as to replace one tyrant with another, but to oblige that government to check itself. And so, how do you do that? That's the classic dilemma of political theory. They devised, they thought we need to separate the powers. We can't just have the king. Or even the prime minister, which united or continues to unite the executive and legislative powers in a parliamentary system. We have to divide those even further so that executive, legislative, and judicial are separated. And we have these colonies, which now become states of the new republic, since we're independent, that have their own powers. And it's important to recognize that they have their own legitimacy and sovereignty. We have these dual sovereigns triple sovereigns, really, because the people retain their own sovereignty as well. Any power that they haven't delegated to the federal government, haven't consented to giving to their state government, they still retain. And they took that very seriously, the framers did. So we have to have this kind of convoluted Rube Goldberg device of a government system, because if we make it too streamlined, then there's a danger of oppression. Maybe oppression by one singular tyrant, so we can't make the president too powerful. Maybe oppression by the mob, so we can't make it too majoritarian, too purely democratic. Maybe oppression by the aristocrats, by the elite. So we have to have other kinds of checks on the various departments of the government. And you have to constantly tweak that, was their thought. Jefferson said, maybe he was exaggerating, that we need, a new revolution every 20 years. But certainly every generation needs to examine, are those checks and balancing working, or is there a warping of power such that there are oppressions that we shouldn't allow if we believe in this classical theory of self-governance?
You have referenced and we've talked a little bit about this term originalism. What is that? What is originalism? Lay it out for me.
Yeah, it's simply the theory that, first of all, the law is fixed as written. You write what the law is on the page, and that does not change. You try to understand what that meant when it was written, by using dictionaries, by using the Federalist Papers to try to explain those early provisions, or the debates in the Reconstruction Congress for the 14th Amendment. What do those terms mean, whether it's due process, or unreasonable search and seizure, or interstate commerce, all of these terms that let constitutional lawyers debate. And that's it. It's not the idea that our understanding of the law can't change, or we can't apply that law to new circumstances. For example, just because when Congress was given the power to regulate interstate commerce, they didn't even have steamships, let alone trains or airplanes, doesn't mean we can't understand that a plane flying from New York to LA is involved in interstate commerce. It also doesn't mean that if we're trying to figure out whether a state can restrict violent video games, the question isn't to think about, well, what would James Madison have thought about violent video games? Well, no, it's look at the text of the First Amendment, try to understand it, try to use legal tools to analogize the concerns about restricting printing presses or newspapers, or what, how people thought about what free speech meant, and apply this in this genre. Were they concerned? Were there exceptions understood for things involving kids, for example? I mean, lots of things. Lawyers have analogical reasoning tools that they're taught in law school to how to deal with these problems. But of course, some things are not foreseen. And so that's why we have an amendment process to provide a new law or new structures, or either it's not foreseen, or it keeps working in a way that we don't like. So we give women the right to vote, and things like that. So originalism is neither about thinking about what men, slave-owning men in powdered wigs would have thought about a particular problem. It's not getting into their heads, nor is it about fixing an amber any type of social development or progress or what have you. It's simply about applying the law on the page and trying to understand what those words meant when they were enacted.
How should I understand the differences between what I hear you saying as the letter of the law, and then colloquially, we hear this term, the spirit of the law? Are these just like turns of phrase? Is there an important way in which these two terms, the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, are meaningful as a lawyer and as a constitutional scholar?
The spirit of the law is very philosophical. It's kind of, you step back and, well, let's take the Trump trial. Let's bring it back to what we started with. That trial and prosecution observed the forms of the law. A duly elected DA brought a valid indictment, presumably, however that works with the grand jury, or the proper vehicle for getting those charges laid before the court and presented to the defendant. There was a duly sworn jury that were vetted using constitutional protections so that both sides could strike someone they thought that was biased. There's a judge who was properly appointed. You know, all of these formalities of the law, and fundamentally the jury charge was both sides were able to present evidence, and there are certain things on appeal that we might not agree with, but that's all through the normal process. Anyway, so that's all the letter of the law. But you step back, is this really the spirit of the law in the sense that if it was, anybody other than, if we do think that nobody other than Donald Trump would have been prosecuted in this manner, then something fishy is going on. And that sense of fundamental justice or fishiness or what have you, I think is one way of understanding the spirit of the law. It's not about checking boxes or dot crossing T's, being very legalistic about things. It's that background conception of why do we care about these legalistic things, and that's to have the rule of law. Because otherwise, if we weren't legalistic, then it would all be airy-fairy and hand-waving and arbitrary. But again, the legalisms are necessary but not sufficient to have the rule of law or a well-functioning or an accepted justice system in which the public has confidence.
Is there, you talked about the political change that takes place during the New Deal era, where the process of changing the formal law of the land through amendments is sort of thrown out the window, in the name of just doing it. Like, well, we can just do it. Let's just do it. Let's just create new agencies. Let's just declare, for example, one case I am familiar with from that time period is let's decide that a man growing wheat on his own land for his own consumption impacts interstate commerce because he would otherwise buy wheat and probably across state lines. I think this is the Filburn case.
Yes, Wickard versus Filburn.
So, so it's like, so we see these things, they happen, they get baked into our precedent. Again, I'm asking basic questions here. Like, so precedent, what role does precedent play in the law? And is that a function of like like that we're sort of a British common law type thing? Like, help me understand the role precedent plays, because precedent doesn't feel like the letter or doesn't feel like it's the same thing as what's written. It's something else.
Well, it is because we're a common law system, a common law country. Yes, the Anglo-American tradition where judges build upon previous decisions of judges that they respect because novel fact patterns come up and they have to apply the law to these situations. And so they reason, is this like this case or not like that case? Do we need to kind of have a new rule? How will ruling in this way in this case affect some other case down the line? Does this make sense? That's why when you hear oral arguments, there's all these hypotheticals. Counsel, I understand what you're asking for. That might make sense in this case, but what about, and they come up with some other thing that could happen if this is the new rule. Would that make sense? Would that be good law? And so that's why judges are hesitant to overturn precedent because people rely on the law as it develops. And sometimes it might cause more institutional disruption, societal disruption to correct that small error from 50 years ago than to let it lie. Because people's expectations, how they structure their lives, how they organize their businesses, all depend on that rule, even if that's an improper application of the statute or of the constitutional provision. Different judges, different professors, different legal scholars have different views about the weight of precedent, what's called stare decisis, the doctrine that you let the decision stay sometimes when it's erroneous. Not too many are consistent. On the Supreme Court, I would say that Justices Kagan and Thomas are the most consistent in that Thomas always votes to overturn precedent if he thinks it's wrong, and Kagan essentially doesn't. Uh, you know, with the rest, it's kind of it depends, and they try to reason their way out of it. But you can find examples where they both uphold or not. For a long time, our debate over the strength of precedent was a proxy war over Roe versus Wade and the right to abortion. Of course, 2 years ago, Roe
Right.
itself was overturned in the Dobbs case. So now maybe we'll be talking about precedent in a different way. I'm much closer to the Thomas view. If something's wrong, you fix it. And, maybe that means giving Congress a year, stay your mandate for a little while to give Congress a chance to fix it or something like that. There are prudential ways of handling things, but oftentimes these things called reliance interests can be overstated.
I'm going to change gears here for a moment. You are you're like the Shane Gillis of academic law in that you were invited into a prestigious institution, and before you could even get started, you were suspended and ultimately didn't join the institution. Um, if you're familiar with the Shane Gillis and
Yes.
Saturday Night Live. Um, let's talk about that for a little bit because it's adjacent to a lot of the things you're writing about, and it's interesting. So, what
Yeah, it's
happened?
it's it's the reason why I'm now, spending as much time on education policy as on, what I'd rather be focusing on the Dormant Commerce Clause and, the defamation law and all of these other things. So I had been at the Cato Institute, big libertarian think tank in DC, for nearly 15 years. I'd become vice president, director of the Constitutional Studies Center there, and got the opportunity to try to make an impact in a different way. Randy Barnett, the godfather of libertarian legal scholarship, if you will, certainly one of them, hired me to become the executive director of the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. And a few days before I was due to start that job in January of 2022 was when Justice Breyer's retirement broke in the news. So I was commenting all day. I'm a Supreme Court expert, so this is my bread and butter. I'm doing media. And that night, I was on the road. I was in Austin, Texas. I was in my hotel room and I was doom scrolling Twitter, which is not a best practice. I don't recommend it. And getting frustrated that Joe Biden was keeping with his campaign promise to appoint a black woman. I thought, as it turned out, most Americans agreed with this in various polls, that he should pick the best candidate. And I tweeted, if I were a Democratic president, I would pick the chief judge of the DC Circuit, which is considered to be the second most important court. He's very progressive, very intellectual, respected, also happens to be an Indian American immigrant, so checks some demographic boxes. But alas, under today's hierarchy of intersectionality, we will end up with a lesser black woman, by which I meant less qualified, by which I meant everyone in the universe, under my logic, would be less qualified than this person who I was positing would be my pick as Democratic president. But anyway, those three words got me in trouble. I went to bed after pushing send, and I woke up and all hell had broken loose. People were coming after my job. It was, cancel culture, whatever you want to call it. I tell you, John, this was probably the second worst day of my life after my mom's untimely passing when I was in college. I felt my whole life, my whole career, everything I'd worked towards, everything my parents had sacrificed in bringing me from the Soviet Union was crumbling over one poorly phrased tweet. So I started doing damage control, and thankfully I have highly qualified, experienced friends in this realm,
Yeah.
notably at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, who helped me with crisis management and PR and things like this, as well as many others. Reporters and others came out of the woodwork to tell my story and to defend me and things like this. Um, 4 days later, I had 4 days of hell. And the dean, who was not a profile in courage, Bill Traynor at Georgetown, announced that he wasn't firing me. He wasn't defending me on the basis of free speech. He was deferring, sending me into an investigation by the DEI Office in Human Resources. He was onboarding me and immediately suspending me with pay because his lawyer advised him that I would later less be able to sue him if I was being paid not to work during this investigation. So 4 months later, because it takes 4 months to investigate, a tweet under a very short policy regarding discrimination, harassment, free speech. These are the relevant policies. 4 months later, they determined that, oh, I hadn't been an employee when I tweeted, and so these policies don't even apply to me.
4 months
Yes,
for that?
yeah, it's they spent $1 million on a white shoe law firm to advise them, and ultimately looked at a calendar. I mean, I'm saying this facetiously. They decided, once the students were off campus and stopped protesting and counter protesting, they could have this kind of resolution. I temporarily celebrated this technical victory, but then I got the report in fine print from the DEI office, which in Georgetown is the Office of IDEA, Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action, IDEA, which made clear that anytime I would say something that someone claimed offense from, that would create a hostile educational environment and would put me back into the Inquisition, even though their free speech policy was supposed to prevent something like that. But I realized over that weekend that I had to quit, and I did what we lawyers call a noisy exit, publishing my resignation letter in the Wall Street Journal, and then announcing my next move to the Manhattan Institute on Fox News the next day, and away we went. And ever since, I've been using this platform I've been given, this spotlight that I've inadvertently had shined on me, to expose the rot in academia and push back on these illiberal trends.
I appreciate you sharing that the way you did, and I've got to imagine that that moment, that next day, must have truly been like, it's a weird thing, right? We live in this bifurcated existence, especially if we're noisy loudmouths like you and I, where we go onto the screen. Actually, all of us do this because our kids do it on Instagram and do things that are like frictionless, and they almost feel like they live in another world. But then sometimes they come into the physical world, and when they do, you get the physical impact. What did you, beyond focusing on higher ed, what do you have a regret? Do you feel like it was being too mouthy? Like what else did you learn from that moment? Like, how do you think about being someone of whether it's being a public intellectual or being someone who's going to be in an environment where you're looked up to by students? How do you think about that? What are the lessons that came away from that in retrospect now with time?
I mean, I'm more cautious on Twitter, I suppose. Some might dispute that, seeing what I've been tweeting necessarily, but it's more just the scales falling from my eyes about some of the pathologies in our society. I thought I had been walking into this with my eyes open. I had spoken at many, many law schools around the country, law review symposia, Federalist Society events, all sorts of different things. I knew the constitutional battles. I thought I knew Georgetown and its ideological skew, and yet I still stepped into it. I mean, look, I poorly phrased that tweet, and I freely admitted that. I published a piece about should you apologize if you're being, canceled on this in City Journal a couple of months ago in the spring issue. So I'll commend that to your listeners. So look, I said, look, this was a failure of communication. I'm sorry that I, didn't convey what I meant to, and that detracted from my message that Biden shouldn't have been using racial and sexual criteria for his Supreme Court pick. But I'm not going to apologize beyond that. I'm not going to apologize for holding that view. I'm not going to apologize for being against affirmative action. I'm not going to apologize for a whole host of things, which would, again, have people protesting because Georgetown, which, controlled by the left, dares hire this rabid right-wing, Cato person to be on their faculty. I'm not gonna bend the knee to any of that orthodoxy. So, my wife says I would have gotten in trouble sooner or later, and that's absolutely true, I think, by something I wrote, something I said on TV. Who knows? I was interviewed by Megyn Kelly in that brief period between when I got my technical victory and when I realized, read the fine print and realized I had to resign. Maybe I said something in that interview that someone would have seen and glommed onto like right away. So, I just learned, it's a depressing thought, but the idea is Um, uh, the left's institutional control is not, they're going to be torn, kicking and screaming to give any of that power up. So, I'm back in the think tank world, and I'm back in media influencer world and filing briefs and all of this. I have a higher profile for the experience. I got a book deal. I'm on Substack, all these other things. But it's a different sort of impact than were I on faculty at a Georgetown or some other school like that. So that's something that I'm still, I guess, working through a little bit. Whether my newfound acclaim, such as it is worth those 4 days of hell followed by the 4 months of purgatory. I don't know. I don't know. But that's, man plans and God laughs, and this is the lazy river, not so lazy river that I'm on now.
One of the things, there's so many pieces of what happened that we could talk about. And we're coming to the end of our time together.
I mean,
But
look,
one thing that
I've felt it a little bit the other way. I was up for a Senate confirmed position in the Trump administration, and was dinged by some 20-something in White House personnel for some deleted Never Trump tweet from 2015. And that's arbitrary because as I've learned, there are people who were much more in that vein that did get hired, and it just depended on which 20-something in White House personnel you got that the given week that the vetting was going on.
it's always going to be messy life, right? We're always going to confront these things that are like judgment calls. But I think one of the things that to keep on the sort of legal and educational track. So you have this tweet, which I don't have a problem with. I mean, yes, lesser black woman doesn't sound great taken out of context, but I'll tell you what doesn't sound great to me is pre-announcing that you're going to nominate people on criteria that have nothing to do with the competence of the job. If I'm someone that wants that job, like if the next president said, I am going to make sure that I nominate for something important and a bearded Italian American, I would not feel great if I got the job, because I would kind of know that was why I got the job. It's like so fundamental. The fact that this has gotten like controversial to me is shocking, because it's such an affront to the people who then have to step into the role, right? It's like nobody wants to be the diversity hire. Nobody. Doesn't matter what color you are.
I joke that I'm a diversity pick for that Florida Poly board, in that I'm one of the 3 trustees that don't have a STEM background. It's a purely STEM school, so hopefully I'm adding something to that conversation.
But I think there's something deeper going on here, which I think cuts to the heart um, of the cases that we're seeing and this sort of wokeness mind virus that's sweeping through our education system. And that is the difference between intent and impact. And I want to hear from you about this. My understanding, Jonathan Haidt's talked about this in The Coddling of the American Mind. This is part of the shift with this sort of critical social justice. Intent is, hey, I said this thing, but I didn't intend for it to be offensive in the way you're taking it. And that's the judgment for whether you did something wrong or not. I didn't intend for it to be offensive in that way. Impact is, I don't care what you intended. I feel offended, therefore you're guilty. And of course, if that's the criteria for whatever it might be, like whether I subjectively feel butthurt, well, that's a path to hell, because anybody can feel anything. We don't have control over other people's feelings in anything that we do. But in the case of the law, isn't intent a really important piece of how we understand the nature of crimes committed? From a legal perspective, help me put intent versus impact in context.
Absolutely. I mean, in the criminal law, there's the idea of the guilty mind, mens rea, which part of the problem with that we discussed about overcriminalization is we have so many regulatory crimes that don't even require that. One of your employees running a bulldozer, hits some protected habitat, and all of a sudden you're in jail for because you're the supervisor or something like that. Anyway, there's all sorts of things like that. Here, there's the overlay of that it's speech versus conduct. Not that something you say should never get you fired, but an aspect of cancel culture is disproportionate punishment. It's also being uncharitable, misreading what somebody says. Anyway, but yeah, I think it's problematic to apply punishments just because of discounting somebody's intent and not understanding the full picture and just going by subjective effect or even claimed effect.
Why is intent important? Like, I know there's the concept
Because
of
we
mens
want to, I
rea.
mean, in the criminal law, we want to punish guilty people. We don't want to punish people who, we don't want to allow someone who's, gets offended all the time just to put people in jail when they're slighted. Um, in the non-criminal context, because you want to see if that person is qualified for the job or not. And if they're attending one thing, but the effect is something else. Um, that can matter sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. If you're recklessly shooting at something and kill someone, we evaluate. It's not that's the difference between first degree murder versus second degree murder or manslaughter. Did you have the intent to kill, or were you being reckless, or was it at the height of your passions, or something like that?
Yeah.
In the context of speech, I mean, we're not I hope criminalizing speech, but in the decision whether to fire someone for speech, it's what did you actually mean? What did you intend to mean? Those are relevant to whether you can do your job. And is the person claiming offense because they're actually offended? Should be objective offense or subjective offense. Anyway, there's lots of layers here that we can discuss, and to coin a phrase, it depends on the context.
um, how has to speaking of it depends on the context. How has you touched on this briefly. What's happened in the aftermath of 10/7 and the way uh, the elite universities have conducted themselves, have um, handled the student bodies over the past 8 months. How has that had an impact on the way you think about things? Has it confirmed all your worst fears? Has it um, been challenging in any ways for you?
It's elevated the crisis in higher ed into the national public discourse, and so I'm thinking and talking about it even more than I would have been otherwise. The anti-Semitism gloss is certainly something, and I'm Jewish, and so I've kind of a lot of American Jews have kind of been rethinking their relationship to their community. What does their culture mean? What does their, personal philosophical things like this, as well as politically speaking. Progressive Jews all of a sudden lost friendships and allyships, as they call it, with folks they thought that were on their side. Um, in terms of kind of public policy, anti-Semitism is always, as Bill Ackman, the billionaire investor and Harvard alum, wrote the same day that Claudine Gay resigned the Harvard presidency in January. Anti-Semitism is always the canary in the coal mine. It's a leading indicator. It's the tip of the iceberg, to throw even more metaphors at this, that signals that there are serious problems underneath. And in this context, that means double standards, that means ideological discrimination, that means academic corruption of various kinds, failures of leadership. All of that has been revealed through the prism of the failure to grapple with all of these anti-Semitic protests, not just in terms of upholding free speech, but in failing to enforce rules when there are violations of, that go beyond speech. I wrote an essay for the Free Press, Barry Weiss's publication, about half a year ago, delineating the differences between speech and action. For example, the most colorful example was somebody urinated on a Hillel and claimed that, well, this was politically expressive, so they shouldn't be charged. So, sorry, whether you're beating somebody up or urinating on a building, you're not going to, get off because you're claiming a First Amendment exemption to that. So speech versus conduct. Then there's unprotected speech, death threats, true threats, as the Supreme Court has defined them, or incitement of violence. Again, a high bar, but has been reached in certain circumstances. And then there's time, place, and manner regulations, which we've been talking a lot about in the context of the encampments, that you can't disturb classes, you can't block access to things. In the off-campus context, think about, we want to protect political speech. That's the core of the First Amendment. And yet I can't go into your neighborhood in the middle of the night and with a megaphone tell you exactly what I think about Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Time, place, manner. Can't block roads, regardless of what expressive content that might be. So those are some legal frameworks, but more broadly, it's exposed the double standards, hypocrisy, leadership weakness, the bubbles that all of these people are living in. I mean, the inability in December, before you talk about the legal context and do a little seminar on First Amendment law, that like the kind that I just gave you, you can't say, well, calling for anybody's death is against our values. You can't open with that. That really shows what kind of a bubble and kind of a failure of moral leadership there was then. And I don't blame the lawyers who coached all these university presidents who are paid big bucks to think big thoughts and protect their university brands. And that was a colossal failure there. So all of these things have come to the fore. And you know what? It's not so much, there are some delicious ironies, like the folks that would have, disciplined you for using the wrong pronoun on October 6th. Now, demand free speech protections for, hitting and blocking and excluding Jewish students from the campus square. Americans have the right to be hypocrites. It's more the not enforcing the rules and just complete failure to uphold the classical liberal values of any institution of learning.
How do you feel about where we're heading, like from a momentum perspective as a country? Meaning, we're heading into this election with two, I think it's just a statement of fact to say, deeply flawed candidates for our two major parties. And then all this legal cloud, which includes the president's son on gun charges and all kinds of stuff like that. So we feel like we're in, certainly for my adult lifetime, relatively uncharted waters. They're maybe not unprecedented, but certainly a former sitting president coming for re-election as a now convicted felon is a new thing. Do you feel like this is the dark before the dawn? Is there trends that are positive? Or is it
as John McCain liked to say, it's always darkest before it's pitch black, right?
Right, which is possible. You mentioned Argentina earlier. To briefly recount, Argentina was before the Peronists smashed the place to smithereens. It was in the running to perhaps be an even wealthier country than the United States of America. Large, natural rich, classical liberal tradition, a country on the move. And then in come the populist, lunatics and don't cry for me, Argentina. Oh, maybe you should cry for Argentina instead. So is it don't cry for me, America, or what do you think?
Well, we thought the writers of 2016 couldn't be topped, but then came 2020 and now comes 2024. So I hope we stop the sequels at this point. In terms of the illiberal political flows, the wokeness and all of that. With society writ large, I'm with Brett Kavanaugh. I live on the sunrise side of the mountain. I'm optimistic with higher ed. I don't know. We're in the eye of the storm. There's some pushback now, some possibility of reform. universities abandoning diversity statements and presidents resigning and trustees becoming a little more active, maybe alumni holding back donations somewhat. I don't know. I'm not saying I'm optimistic, but I'm less pessimistic than I was when I quit Georgetown coming up on 2 years ago now. Actually, what is it? We're recording this June 7th. Yeah, it was 2 years ago yesterday that I quit Georgetown. So happy Liberation Day to me. Um, but in terms of the political context, gosh, I'm just a simple constitutional lawyer. I mean, I just hope we can get past November's election with truly mostly peaceful protests, not ironically labeled as such. Um, there are going to be bad things happening, whatever the electoral outcome is. I hope they don't outweigh the good either way, or not by too much. Um, but I don't know. I mean, hopefully we'll have new presidential candidates in 2028. Um, I guess only one of them will be able to run again, uh, if they're still alive. But I try not to focus on the presidency unduly, or even on the federal government. I have my little platoon of four kids, 8, 6, and 18-month-old twins are cancellation babies. That's right. During my Georgetown purgatory, we found out my wife was pregnant, and then we found out she was really pregnant. So that's a delight. And in all seriousness, and we'll see what happens. But I can't be down for too long. And I like visiting with interesting, smart people like you, John, and talking about these important issues. So hope your some of your listeners start following me now. I have a Substack, Shapiro's Gavel, my book coming out, Lawless, and I hope to continue to be engaged on all of these issues going forward.
You put a great cap on that, but I will ask you the question I end every show with, um, which is, we call this Dad Saves America because I believe that as a man, being a dad, embracing that role is the most heroic thing we get to do. And that when we do it, as you just said, we are helping with our wife to lead the platoon that matters the most, first as a family, and then in our community, and then by virtue of the fact that we're all doing it, if we all did it well, the country. How do you understand your role in the American story?
I mean, I'm living the American dream. I was born in the Soviet Union. My dad's dad was taken by Stalin's secret police, and my dad was exiled to Siberia, coming back when Khrushchev came during the thaw. My mom grew up in the outskirts of Moscow in the 50s without running water and electricity at first. She ended up getting a PhD, but was discriminated against for both being a woman and being Jewish. And they eventually took me to Canada first. I joked that we took a wrong turn at the St. Lawrence Seaway. And I ended up, with an Ivy League degree and the University of Chicago and all those great accolades that you read at the outset, um, meeting with senators and developing legislation and talking to all the top shows and influencers and all the rest of it. As my erstwhile countryman Yakov Smirnov would say, "What a country!" Right? And here with my wife from Kansas, um, uh, with four kids. I'm an only child. She's an only child, and we're raising them here in suburban Virginia, in the cradle of the Republic, right? Just amazing. Um, so serendipity is good, and despite the rocky world that we're in, the world on fire, as some people put it, um, I do the best I can to advance freedom, to help my family grow, and to continue the idea that the next generation, to keep with your theme of dad saving the world, that my next generation does even better on as many metrics as possible, as my wife and I have been able to do.
Ilya Shapiro, thanks for being on Dad Saves America.
My pleasure. I'm sorry I wasn't able to somehow insinuate a dad joke in here. My wife's actually given me not one, but two t-shirts that make dad jokes about my making dad jokes. So we'll have to save that for a future speed round or something. Well, you know where I keep my dad jokes? In a database.
You did it.